Welcome to Get the Elephants Out of the Room. I'm Chris Webber. We all have to deal with difficult people at work, difficult managers, difficult colleagues and difficult customers. In this podcast, we share stories and experiences of people like you who face these challenges and share their secrets to success. Our mission is to help everyone overcome obstacles and to become more confident, better communicators. So sit back and relax while we unravel the mysteries of another difficult person. Today, very pleased to have Anthony Carter join me on the podcast. Anthony is Vice President, Global Sales at Nanpower Semiconductor. They're an early-stage semiconductor manufacturer where he leads global commercial execution and helps build the processes and partner motions needed to scale the business. He's had over a 20-year career in senior commercial leadership roles in both large corporates and smaller high-growth businesses. He led teams and shaped go-to-market strategies across EMEA, North America, and APAC. And his background experience has seen him involved and often leading complex commercial and technical negotiations, where contracts and deployments span multiple sites, countries, and stakeholder groups. He's often involved in distribution partner ecosystems and in global supply chains. Anthony's recognised in his industry for building and developing high-performance teams, which is why we wanted to talk to him today. And his cultures are built on trust, clear standards, and accountability. And of course, handling difficult conversations early and constructively. Thank you, Anthony. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. What a great introduction. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us, what are you working on right now, Anthony? Where are you focused your energy at the moment?
Well, for me, Chris, I'm with a semiconductor startup, so an early technology startup, and we're pre-revenue. So at this moment in time, my role and my objectives are building the commercial bench strength to take the product to market through multiple channels, through multiple sales organizations, and through multiple partners across the globe in the three regions where we see high potential and where the market will support us, such as the US, Europe, and the Middle East and the Far East.
Exciting times, and I guess a strange place to be sitting as a commercial person, as a revenue person, without revenue. We were so used to having the day job to do, and I guess it's a luxury to be able to be building the infrastructure around you before you have that expectation and pressure. But I imagine it's a bit weird.
Yeah, so I'm one of those individuals where the first thing I used to do in the corporate world was look at the sales numbers for yesterday. So waking up in the morning and feeling the pressure of a different kind of KPI, which is scaling, which is difficult to quantify sometimes, is very different.
Yeah, no, I can imagine it. Are you enjoying it? Is it a place you're finding your feet and comfortable?
Yeah, it's very different. I mean, after spending, like yourself, some time in the corporate world where there is a pace, there is activity, there are departments, there are other colleagues that you can rely on. And in a small scale startup like this, if you don't do it, it doesn't get done. But I guess what comes with that is the feeling that everything that you do is making a difference, and even the small steps that you make on a daily basis aggregate very quickly into sizable changes in terms of the go-to-market strategy, who you're talking to for distribution. And what's really pleasing for me is the feedback you get from those partners who really want to get on board with you. And I have to say that I've been really impressed with the quality of the conversations and how far we've come in a relatively short time. So, we're destined for bigger things.
Absolutely. And when you say small, how small are you at the moment? Is it a very small team? What are the numbers you've got at the moment?
Yeah, we're sub 30 people at the moment, and what we have is a technology that is unique. And for anybody that's listening that's ever worked within the semiconductor space, the design of our semiconductor is a tricky semiconductor to have designed, which is what makes it unique and creates a high level of intellectual property. but we've got some very smart people within our organisation, and the majority of the colleagues that we're working with are actually in the design of the semiconductor based in our design office in Porto, in Portugal. So that they've almost done their bit. Now it's the piece that takes it to market, and we get some revenue.
Very nice, very nice. Let's talk. Let's turn to talk about difficult people at work and difficult challenges. I'm sure you've got a few ahead of you as you come to launch, and I imagine. Did you say you're building a distribution network here? So you're going to be working with partners.
Yes, that's correct. What's traditionally the most effective way of addressing large scale customer interaction is through distributor channels that are technically competent, that can take the product to market on our behalf and talk to design engineers. And we've purposely made the decision to be working with partners that have that level of technical expertise. So we're very deep in the organizations of the and the infrastructure of the companies that we're working with around the globe.
And I think this is, I mean, it's not an unusual model. I've got a number of clients that I've worked with over the years who operate distribution programs in various different industries. It's a very common system to take with. Lots of people take it because it seems relatively easy. You buy into an existing infrastructure and you know into their channels of communication and supply, et cetera, et cetera. But it does come with its downsides, and the downsides are you're working with a partner who doesn't necessarily see the world the way you see the world, who doesn't necessarily operate in the ways that you want them to operate, have different priorities than your particular portfolio. How are you navigating through this as you start to communicate with partners and start to look for the right people to join you on this exciting new journey?
Well, you're quite right. I think we are little old nanopower. We're not a world force or a world brand when it comes to carving out mind share with some of the partners that we're talking with. For me, being effective in those scenarios is cascading the information and creating some excitement and buzz and making it really simple for their sales assets and their sales partners to be selling our product. And with that comes a lot of training. It's a lot of presence. It's a lot of incentivization, and it's making the whole process easy. If we can make selling our product easier than selling not a competitor's product, but maybe a one that has more mind share, then that's where we're going to win.
Hmm. Sounds easy, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If only.
Yeah. And then you're going to layer on top of that, I guess, cultural differences, cultural changes, and global international politics. I'm sure that's at the heart of some of the thinking you guys have. You know, your technology that you're working on is very in the news at the moment.
Yeah, you're right. If we look at the macroeconomic influences that we have today, and we look at the US and we look at China, we're probably in the best place in Europe, which means we can quite easily, I say easily in inverted commas, work with China for designs and work with the US on brand new designs for their end products without having to get into the China versus the US politics that we have. We're kind of like Switzerland in the middle of this, hopefully.
But no, but it's interesting because I think to me, that's a good strategy for dealing with difficult people. There's a sense at times of, do we need to pick a side? Which, you know, how do we pick a winner or a loser? And I was reading about Napoleon in the past, and I found him an interesting element. And there's lots of debate about his early life and things that he did and things that he didn't do. But he was obviously coming to fruition during the French Revolution, and one thing he didn't do was pick a side. He was very neutral. He was whilst he was in the army, he didn't pick one side or the other. And there's an argument which is that allowed him to be able to navigate both sides, not to play both sides necessarily, because it sounds too manipulative. And maybe he was doing that, but there's a sense of navigating the space in between, and that to me is a really solid strategy, and it's a time-tested strategy. That it's not that you're against either one, you're not playing people off against each other, but you're navigating the space that exists between them and finding how you can best operate on both sides of the fence. I like the Switzerland idea.
Yeah, wouldn't it be easy if it was as simple as that? I, there are challenges. I think that if you look at the global state of the electronics industry and components, it's a shifting sands, and all of us within our personal lives have seen the effect of semiconductor shortages or component shortages. When if you remember the car situation, automotive situation, just coming out of COVID, where lead times went out because of the semiconductor shortage. So we have this to negotiate through, on top of launching a brand new product into every market. And the products that we have is agnostic in terms of its application. It isn't military and aerospace. It isn't for automotive. It fits everywhere, and that's where we solve problems for our customers. And that's where we don't need to take a side. If we can make our product available, talk about the benefits to our end customers that are eventually going to be designing this into an end product, then providing we have the right distribution routes, we have the right focused sales partners around the world, we can access the markets that naturally align to our problem solving, or we're able to push deeper into the verticals that are our choice.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So, look, what is your personal experience of difficult challenges? If I said to you, difficult customer or difficult colleagues, what jumps to mind, Anthony?
I, I've got something that lives with me still today, Chris. Early in my career, I was working for a electronic component manufacturer that was involved in memory. And as part of that company's journey, we acquired a very large piece of business from another manufacturer. They'd carved out some of their non-profitable business, and we acquired it. And with that acquisition came a very large customer that was already using that product, and they transferred that customer to us. Little did we know at that point that they were selling this product at a loss to this customer in the millions every year. And they were using it, great British phrase, as a sprat to catch a mackerel. They were using this product to gain access to the more profitable parts of their business. We picked it up, best intentions, had a very short meeting to understand that we were about twice the price, that they'd been enjoying this product for some years. And there was nowhere for us to go and nowhere for this particular buyer, a very senior buyer in a very large organization, to go. And that was really where our impasse started. And this wasn't an overnight, this went on for around 6 months, where certainly if we look at the interpersonal relationship, he was definitely more of the aggressor, had the ego, was pushed into a corner where his costs were spiraling, where he previously had them under control. There was no solution. And we knew he was talking to competitors to try and dislodge us from his bill of materials for everything that he was building. Mm-hmm. And we never really, it took us a long time to get to the point where we were able to have a on the table discussion about something constructive. It was literally a handbags at dawn situation that was going on for months.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to dig into this a little bit more, because I don't think this is that unusual. I think that, I know plenty of organizations who divest brands and look to find people who want to pick up these products, and they see them as opportunity. They see them as something that doesn't fit to our portfolio that might fit with someone else's portfolio. But what you're saying here is that it was a shock for the key customer, for one of their largest customers, that they hadn't even really understood that it was being sold at a loss to them. Is that kind of part of where this comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a palpable shock for this particular customer that when we started to disclose our pricing as part of the handover process, there was a deadly silence descended in the room. And yeah, exactly. He was in a situation where all he saw was the buy price. It more than doubled, and without doing too much of a calculation, realised there was a significant impact to the profitability of his business, which was one of his key drivers, was to drive that down.
And so from his perspective, he felt like you were exploiting a position of power because you come in, you're taking over this brand, and you've doubled the price. And we've heard these stories, and there was something in the press a number of years ago in the US where insulin. There was only one company that were manufacturing insulins, and all of a sudden they like quadrupled the price because they said no one else can provide it, therefore we can charge whatever we want. And when you hear these kind of horror stories, I guess he found himself, or he felt like that's what you were trying to do.
Yes, definitely, and we actually were not. I mean, we were the pricing that we went in with was on minimal margin to ensure that we retained the revenue. But it was a very difficult conversation to have because it's not uncommon to have open book pricing in certain situations where we show the margin and you have margin improvement programs, but this was not one of them. Certainly was not shared with the incumbent before they passed over to us. And you're right, his first reaction was, "You guys are ripping me off. You've got me as a captive audience, and this is where we are. I can't accept this. Please leave." It's almost that kind of conversation. And I had, just to give this some scale, this was a multi-million-dollar piece of revenue on one line of product, and we were talking over $15 million at the time.
Yeah.
So this is not a small amount of increase if you think about just doubling that in terms of its cost.
Yeah.
It's a big bitter pill to swallow.
And was it the only product he bought from you, or was there other stuff that was in the portfolio?
That was the only product, and I think that was one of the challenges. Was we had nowhere else to go, and he had nowhere else to go in terms of trading concessions with anything else that we were or could potentially supply. And
Yeah.
to make matters worse, we were a single source. So therefore, he had to buy it from us. And it was a natural conclusion to make, as we all would, which is, you've got me in a corner and you're trying to make as much money out of me. But that's absolutely not the case.
There's you earlier on you mentioned it was ego. He became quite an aggressor. All he could see was his cost spiraling, and given that his job title or his job function was manage costs and maintain that, he's going to have some very difficult conversations internally, because surely this is something they're going to have to pass through to their customers further down the supply chain. Was that something that he talked to you about?
It took us a while to get through the initial shock or the initial way that he handled it, and that didn't go away in his behaviours. And look, if we think about his behaviours, Chris, he all of a sudden, from being in a position where he was relatively in control of his cost base, he was in a position where he'd lost control, and everything that we saw was his threat response. He'd lost his ability to have any predictability. It was potentially affecting his status upward within his organization, his reputation, job stability, the whole psychological gamut of feelings that he was going through. But we were unable to have constructive conversations from this impasse. And this went on for some months.
And how did you move things forward?
It was interesting. We're an American business, and my boss at the time, who was the CEO, was over to. We saw some of the customer visits, and we knew it was the right thing to do to see this particular buyer. And because of the status, because what I found, Chris, sometimes is that when people reach the point that there's no solution, they can become very stubborn. And in sales, I've always found that you can almost handle an objection, but if you take a customer or an employee or a colleague to the point where they become stubborn, it's very difficult to move them from that position of stubbornness. And it almost seems that, there's the line in the sand, that's where they're going to stand, that's where you're going to stand. But it took our CEO to be over, and the status broke that stubbornness. And it was probably at the right time as well. So maybe fate had a hand into this. But he pulled our CEO into another room, another meeting room, and said, "Look, I really need your help. This is the situation." Now, if for some reason he was unwilling or unprepared or was in a position where he was not wanting to have that conversation with us and would have it with the CEO, but they left the room very quietly and came back, and the whole tone changed. And what we've done is through that conversation and somebody breaking the silence,
Yeah.
had agreed. We shared what the problems were, the real problems, not just the business problems, but the personal problems that he was going to face if he was unable to solve some of the challenges that this new pricing had created. And it felt like he'd got a plan, and we worked on the
Yeah.
plan. We couldn't get to where we needed to be, but at least we were able to start working backwards, start to talk alternatives. And it was that pivotal meeting that changed materially the way that we managed that whole organization and our partnership moving forwards.
That's really interesting. And if I just analyze that for a second, just kind of unpick what seemed to be happening here is you got a guy who feels backed in a corner. And one of the things I've been playing with is status is very important. You mentioned it a couple of times, and it's wonderful insight into how he was feeling at the time, or maybe how he was feeling at the time. And it's a real threat to his status, right? He's the buyer, he's in charge, it's his job, and here you guys are dictating terms to him, and he's powerless to change it. And the challenge that he has there is that yes, suddenly he's found himself to be powerless, and we react emotionally. We get into that defensive mode and want to protect our status, and we want to show people that we are important and we are valuable. And the other thing that matters here is there's another thing that drives us, and that's visibility. So if we think about what is this going to help my status? Is this going to damage my status? There's a guy who is in a situation where it damages his status, right? He's lost power. But it was so significant that it was also visible across his organization. This wasn't, a 5% price increase that he can bury somewhere else because he can make some gains in other parts of his purchasing. This was so important that everyone noticed. And so then it drives even more because across his organization, people are going, wow, we need to do something about this. This is probably a big problem. And when things fall into that box, the box of damages my status and other people can notice it, then it's a problem I have to fix now. I have to get it done because if I don't, this is like a existential crisis. And what I love about your CEO walking into the room there is it addressed the status game straight away. We're not trying to make you feel small. We've escalated this to someone who's, me as the CEO, and I'm prepared to listen to you. He became vulnerable. He became like, I'll open myself up to you. He didn't walk in that room and say, this is the way it is. You guys have got to suck it up. You've got to pay attention to us. He walked in the room and said, let's find a way to solve this problem. I recognize your pain. That's powerful, isn't it?
It is, and I think it was an intentional move for us, not in a highly politicized manner, and it wasn't particularly choreographed to work that way. We were also, in a position where the margins themselves did not allow us to make big cuts. We were pretty much as low as we could go, and we too were backed into a corner. Look at the balance here of how we both needed the business to continue. This was about 20% of the revenue of our organization at the time. It was quite a small organization. So for us to lose that would have been a disaster, even at slimish margins.
Yeah.
And we'd worked from an engineering perspective to engineer cost out of this particular product. We were stuck as well. So our olive branch was under the pretext of, look, we really, the way that I wanted the meeting to run, and that's always the case, isn't it? This is how I want it to run. This is how it's going to run, but this is how it's actually run.
Yeah.
The initial objectives were to be, look, we just want to be open and honest. If we need to have open book pricing, do that. But it actually took, and hats off to the customer here. It took him to swallow his ego to say, "Can I have a word with you outside?"
Hmm.
and to make that move. And I think it's one of those positions where the planets align and you give people the opportunity to step back, understand that there's desire on both sides to move forward. I think, and the time pressure, of course, I think that's what really worked for it. But you're right, for us to be open and honest, to level, and to talk about a solution moving forward was very powerful for us to come in and be open and honest and prove that we wanted to get a resolution.
And what was the solution? How do you say? Because the way you've just described that seems difficult. He has no alternative that he can find in the marketplace. So you are the unique supplier of this product, but on your side, you can't cut the cost anymore. You're already operating on low margins. You've inherited a product which was a loss. It was selling at a loss, so you have to fix that, and it's important for your organisation. It does seem like a problem you can't solve here.
Yeah, well, we were extremely innovative, um, and it's a really good way of asking that, Chris, because yeah, our backs were to the wall. If we carried on with the same product, we could not do anything further. For us, we were manufacturing a memory product, which wasn't just a single chip. It was a board. There was other components on there. So for us, we had our own bill of materials that we just could not reduce. Um, we'd taken some time to look at alternatives during this 6-month period, and one of the reasons for bringing the CEO over at the time was to talk about options. And one of the options that we had was to design a card that their system thought was the same as the old one, but in fact it was a new one. And we'd use some clever software to kind of trick their systems. We called it a universal solution, that it looked like the old one, even though it was a new one. And on the new board, there was a reduction in, we're using the latest chips, which were cheaper, they were faster, there was some performance. And that's how we agreed to move forward. We never got back down to the original pricing, but we certainly were able to help the customer demonstrate to his management team that we had a plan, it was robust, and we had a roadmap to reduce the costs further from where they were at that current moment in time.
So effectively, you created a new product. You
Correct.
reinvented something.
Yeah, correct. And it was in collaboration. So, if we look at the whole process, after the handover process, we'd gone through a period of conflict, we got through a period of standoff, we got to a point where we just did not know how we were moving forward. And yet, through that whole process, we embarked on a partnership model which went on for many years with shared objectives. And it moved away from a transactional piece of business to one that was built on trust, on agreed KPIs and shared ownership for solving this solution. So, in my career, I have to say this is one of the most difficult situations in terms of conflict to manage, but actually turned out to be one of the things that I talk to my salespeople about when we're demonstrating how partnerships can make a material difference to a business relationship, both in longevity and value for both parties.
It's a wonderful story, and I'm curious: was the solution that you came up, the product, was that something that you could sell to other customers, or was it still a very targeted solution for them?
We actually sold the concept of that product to other customers as a solution, but that one was actually bespoke to this particular customer. But it was beneficial to all of us to start to think about, well, if this customer has got this problem, there are other customers that will no doubt have this problem as well. How do we engineer a solution for other people? So it also changed the way that our product maps worked, which were generally based on faster memory, different form factors, to actually problem solving rather than producing products that could be mass market.
Yeah. No, I was just curious because I think it's you can kind of you could see the solution being, oh well, if we find something that solves a problem, a bigger problem for everyone. But actually, your start point was we need to solve this problem, and then it started to open up into perhaps other people are struggling with the same kind of idea as well. And I think that's really interesting. And I no wonder it's a story that you tell continually with your teams now, with your sales teams now, because I think it's just a wonderful example of doing something. And people often ask me, "Oh, I aim for the win-win, Chris. That's my approach to dealing with customers, and I look for the win-win." It's rare that I've heard anyone genuinely tell me an example of a win-win, and I do think this is a genuine example of a win-win solution because it for me, a win-win has to solve a different problem, if that makes sense. It's a shared problem. His problem is margin on or cost of acquisition. Your problem is margin on the products you're selling. That's an intractable problem. Like this is either side of the same coin. What problem can we solve that helps us with those? That's where there's a genuine win-win, and that's exactly what you did here. Reimagined the ideas.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think in sales and the commercial world, very often we enter into customer negotiations expecting that we know what the win-win looks like.
Mm.
And in certain situations where you've got your bids and tenders, or there is a clear-cut objective that the customer is looking to achieve really early on, they're quite rare when they're actually truly valuable for both parts. It's very simple for any customer engagement for you hit me this price point and you can get an order. That sometimes doesn't feel like a win-win because that's a customer saying that this is the price point I want. That isn't necessarily a win for the supplier.
Mm.
I think there's a lot of engagements with customers where we're talking about long-term engagements where the game is set out really early on. Here's the parameters of being able to be successful in this commercial negotiation. But in reality, if you enter into a longer term contract or relationship, they change during that relationship. And where you're able to demonstrate these win-wins, like we've just demonstrated, it doesn't have to be large scale. They could be, incremental wins. That's where the true partnership occurs. And it's normally partway through a contract or partway through a negotiation rather than being right up front. And it's interesting, I think, to reflect on. We don't normally recognize that as part of the sales process. We enter into these negotiations or discussions really early on, expecting that we know what those mutually beneficial parameters look like. And in actual fact, we don't.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that it's about layering on different aspects and creating your customer strategy based upon that. And it's interesting how you said you started with what was quite a transactional relationship, a buyer seller, and very conflicted, lots of challenge, to a genuine, long lasting partnership. And I just want to unpick that a little bit because I think that's the goal. I hear a lot of people say to me, I want to build strong partnerships. I want to move away from transactional deals. And the difficulty is, as you said, they start these conversations knowing or believing that they know what the win-win looks like or what that solution looks like. And because you didn't, I actually think the journey is what takes you to partnership, because through that journey, you looked at different ways of solving a problem. The problem exists. There are 5 approaches you can take. Approach number 1 is compete. Tell them that's the way it's going to be. We're making money, and it's their problem if they need to solve it. But the effect of that is going to be to further damage that relationship, further damage the ego, and probably accelerate any plans that they have to ditch your product and switch away. Like if they're thinking about it, they're gonna try and do it faster. Another approach is compromise. That wasn't an option for you. You couldn't reduce your prices anymore. You'd already tried to solve it that way. That's not going to work. The third way is to accommodate them. Well, you can't really accommodate because you need to make some money and you need to sell it, and you can't continue to sell it at a loss. So that's not an option that you had. And then the fourth option is to delay it. Well, you could delay it if you wanted to, but the truth was it wasn't going to take you anywhere. You were still, the problem wasn't going to change by waiting for 3 months before you solved it. So you're left with, we genuinely need to solve this problem. and be creative on how we do it. Find a collaborative solution. And then you've got to think about, how's this guy feeling? He doesn't want to engage with you on a creative solution because his ego is pricked. He's looking right now under a lot of pressure from his colleagues. His status in the organization is under threat. So how are you going to build enough trust to have an open conversation? And that comes from where you then decided, let's be vulnerable with this. Let's share with him some information about what we're doing, about our pricing. Let's open this up. And sitting together to resolve this problem, because I guess you needed their cooperation to help you develop these new cards. That journey created a relationship of credibility, expertise, shared value, and openness that just became long lasting.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Chris. So that I'd like to pick up. You said the word vulnerability, and I think one of the challenges that we have in the commercial world and in our own lives is that getting to the openness and having the other party, whether it's a colleague or a boss or a customer, to be opening up and telling you their vulnerabilities in a way, sometimes is prohibitive in moving a relationship on. If I reflect back on that particular example there with the customer, he wasn't allowing himself to be vulnerable. He was absolutely on the back foot, caged tiger, painted in the corner. There was never a human conversation. And I'm sure we've all seen this in our own professional lives and our personal lives, where, okay, well, tell me, what is the problem? What is the one thing that I can do for you? Can we talk about this on a way that we move forward? We never really got to that point until we had that epiphany moment when our CEO was in the room with him. And very often in sales, I'll teach or I'll recommend the people that I'm working with that we ask a certain amount of killer questions. And some of the killer questions are when people are comfortable, when they're disarmed, and you can have a constructive conversation, such as, if we're looking at this engagement, what's the most important thing to you, Mr. Customer, about this engagement? And the customer has to be in the right place to answer that question properly. And reflecting back on the situation we described, we were never in that situation. There was too much turmoil in the room. There was too much pressure around pricing. That was what took, I'm not interested, I just want the pricing. We were never able to move it on constructively. And it's interesting to see those behaviors never changed. And as I say, you're talking about, the stubbornness. There was no back down. There was the ego that was ramping up the stubbornness. I'm not backing down. I'm a senior buyer in this organization. These guys have come in and kind of messed my business up. They've messed up how I look in the organization. I am not backing down. And that's where the ego has been in many situations in my career. You get a customer to that kind of point, and you've really got to think hard about how you de-escalate and get to a point and have that conversation. And there's been plenty of times in my career when I've been listening to customers on customer service where there's not a good time to interject. There has to be the point where you have to get the customer or the colleague to offload, get it off their chest, because there's no point interrupting while they're doing that. And it very much felt like with this customer that he was continuously offloading. And it was a barrage of, you guys need to be doing this. There was never an opportunity to do that, no matter how well we engineered it.
Yeah. Do you know, there's a lot of insight there about giving people the space to vent, giving them the space to feel listened to. One of the aspects when we get emotional is to be listened to. And I remember talking to someone a few years ago about inter-employee conflict. And they said one of the tactics that can work quite well is you sit people in a room and you say, right, you've got 5 minutes to tell them everything that you are frustrated about with the way that they're behaving. And the other person's not allowed to interrupt. And they said, what's interesting is 5 minutes is quite a long time.
Yeah.
And they kind of run out of stuff before they get to the end of 5 minutes often. And so, but they feel so much better that they've got this stuff off their chest. So there's so much power in allowing that then it dissipates the emotion, and now we can have a conversation. And I think the vulnerability part of trust is that to trust someone is about how prepared we are to be vulnerable to their actions. How open are we to allow them to take action and that affects us? And so what you had in this situation was a guy who had no choice. You could do what you wanted with the product, and he could not change it. And that was the barrier for him. It was the loss of control. And so he didn't want to be any more vulnerable to you. He didn't like it. You're exploiting me, and I have no option and no choice. When you gave him control back, when you gave him some power and actually said, we're now going to be vulnerable to you. What do you want? How can we solve this problem? Let's hear you. You gave him back some of that vulnerability. He then felt better about engaging. And that to me is really interesting, because the temptation is it's the dream scenario. We get ourselves into a position where a customer is so dependent upon us, we can dictate terms and they have to be vulnerable to our actions. That's the worst place to be. That's the time when you actually need to be the most sensitive to them, because the risk is creating that guy that you had to manage for 6 months before you fixed it.
Absolutely. I think also, Chris, if you think about it as well, you think about thinking back in the moment, and again thinking of our own interactions with colleagues and people that we're working with, as well as customers, is that I think one of the natural behaviours that I've seen certainly myself exhibit and certainly colleagues exhibit is that when we see that kind of ego play, is there's a need to manage your own ego as well, because your natural reaction is, well, if they're going to show some ego, then I'm going to show some
Yeah.
back, because I don't want to be in the position either where that person almost has the upper hand commercially or interpersonally and makes me feel like kind of the parent-child relationship. And it's very difficult once you're in that scenario not to ratchet up the stubbornness on both sides as a no win. And I think subconsciously in that particular example, we managed that very well. But I just wonder how many times in our personal lives do we not realize that has happened, and we don't create like a fairness narrative
Yeah.
about this is why we're talking like this. We want a positive outcome, that we all become stubborn. We all revert back to our egos and fold our arms and start having tough conversations, and starts to affect the culture and the way that we work together.
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. And I think that I was talking to somebody this week. We shared a coffee, and we were discussing corporate organizations and how important protecting our own status becomes in corporate organizations, and organizations, dynamic young organizations like the one that you're working for, are so hope filled, creative, flexible, adaptive, because at that point you have everything to gain. And so your ego can be open to try things, to experiment, to communicate in slightly different ways, because you're not worried about reputation, or you're not worried about history, or you're not worried about making mistakes, because there's so much opportunity out there. And I'm curious about, have you seen at what point people shift from that hope and that optimism towards just kind of making sure I'm not seen to be blamed, or making sure I'm not seen to be too responsible for problems?
Yeah, well, for us at this moment in time, for what you described as a champagne problem for us, because that means we're succeeding. So we're looking forward to facing that challenge. If I'm honest, I've not seen that shift in the past. I think interpersonal styles, even in startups, you can identify how you're working with individuals, and I think as you become more and more complex, you're probably going to pull more severe or more pointed aspects of those individual interpersonal styles out. I've not seen that, Chris, but it's an interesting question of how do you get from um, an agile organization with zero ego and maximum team to a highly politicized corporate environment, because we both know that they exist.
Yes, right.
I don't know what the tipping point is. I'd be really interested to learn more about that. Perhaps that's a
Yeah,
podcast for another day.
I think it may well be. It may well be. Um, So, Anthony, I mean, you clearly, this is an amazing story and it's a really powerful story, and it's wonderful to share it. You've definitely used it in your lessons for you and your teams working in the future. But how would you summarize the lessons for people listening to the episode, thinking about the challenges that they have? How would you summarize the lessons and advice for others?
Well, I think from a leadership perspective or a sales perspective, I think I've learnt quite a few things about taking people through what I would class really more as a change curve. Because what we did with the customers, we took them from change. We took them through, in this particular story, from where they were comfortable, and we opened a brand new world for this particular customer where change was on the table on the very next day. And we all know what that feels like. And I think change at work is generally resisted, as it is in our personal lives as well. And I don't think it's resisted because people are irrational. I think it's resisted because psychologically it's a change, and it's a threat prediction problem.
Mm,
I think the brain treats uncertainty like risk,
mm,
and when those routines shift or the day to day changes, people lose the ability to reliably answer a few things. Am I
mm,
safe? Am I still competent, and do I belong in a wider context of change in the work environment? And that comes down to, is there a loss of control as a threat response to loss of control? Is my identity the same? And I said, am I still competent or viewed as competence in my role?
mm,
And different people are in different places in terms of accepting change. And part of the role for us in leadership is to reduce the uncertainty, and take people on that journey with us, whether it's a customer or our colleagues. And I've certainly been involved in many organizational restructures or large changes in corporate environment where people feel threatened by change.
mm,
And the advice I would give to any leader would be that you need to reduce the uncertainty faster than you sell the vision. And what I mean by
mm,
that is you have to be very clear of what will stay the same, what will change, what good looks like, and treat status and identity as first class risks. Some people may worry that their experience is irrelevant, that they're being overlooked, that they've not been consulted on any change, um, and make that learning curve um, publicly available. Talk to people about what the changes are going to be. And I
mm,
talked earlier about being, a fairness narrative,
mm,
um, and that's about talking about the trade-offs and who's impacted. Um, some groups lose something like headcount, budget, or autonomy. Don't pretend they're not. Build that trust by not trying to spin that.
mm,
And again, manage your own ego. Certainly, I've been in situations where I've had to present that change is coming, and you can see who's going to be on board and who's not by body language and the questions that are asked. And it's very easy as a leader, because you always have to win as a leader. That's what you're taught. You are the parent in the room, and the the colleagues sometimes are treated as the children. You're paid to lead, but
mm.
I think managing that ego and not getting into a conflict situation and remembering that your role is to bring people on the journey with you is one of the lessons that I think we have to learn to be successful leaders.
think that's wonderful advice, Anthony, and I really appreciate you sharing it. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. It's been a really interesting conversation and so many lessons and insights for people to take away. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing everything.
You're welcome. It's been great to join you, Chris.
Thanks for listening. I hope you took away some useful insights. Join us again next time when we unpick the behaviours of more difficult people. Until then, take care and see you soon.